Thank you. I'm listening to all these speakers, and I feel like I'm truly the newcomer to the block here. I'm looking out over this audience and seeing people who have ministered in this particular harvest field for decades. I only have 1 decade under my belt in this, and so I feel very unqualified to talk about what I'm going to talk about. We started the ministry downtown because, pastors are supposed to be givers, and we wanted to go make a difference. What I soon discovered was that the difference that was probably being made was being made most in my own soul. Because I grew up in a pretty well-to-do family on the South Hill of Spokane, attorney's son. And I had not been exposed to the stories that led people to the street and the lives that kept them just one step off the street. And I would have to say that if God were to solve the homeless and the poverty problem in America tomorrow, I would lose some of the most dear people that have impacted my life deeply. Now, he's going to solve that someday, and I'm grateful for that. But I say that because I think all of us have so much to learn from the people we think we're helping. And I hope that you discover that. It's interesting, when you're a pastor, you're kind of always listening for the Spirit and how he's moving. And I think, Phil, you assigned us these topics, and we didn't talk about how they're going to connect. And I've just been listening, and the Spirit of God has just got some themes running through all of this. Obviously, the relationship piece is one of those. And I'm reminded of a friend of ours who was one of the caseworkers in one of the buildings in which we do a fellowship dinner and Bible study downtown. And he said to me at one point, he said, I'm convinced that 95% of the mental illness that we deal with in this building would be solved if people got into relationship. And that probably is true. The more we've had the privilege of working with folks, it changes even the mental illness picture. Well, Lonnie mentioned I've been tasked with addressing the difference between relief and development when it comes to the homeless. And I say the homeless rather than homelessness because we're talking about people, and we must never forget that. I'd like to start by borrowing from one of the most important helping professions in any community, and certainly here in Spokane. That's the medical profession. What we're trying to do with the homeless is what the medical profession seeks to do every single day with every person in our community who is seriously ill or injured. They properly assess the injuries of the illness, and they properly treat the trauma or the disease so that every patient is healed and rehabilitated to the maximum of their potential. And like medical professions, we must treat individuals. And like the medical profession, we must be thorough, accurate, and well-informed in order to first properly diagnose the problem correctly and then treat the patients. Allow me to frame this issue of the difference between relief and development of the homeless by using this metaphor. Homelessness is analogous to the difference between triage and rehab in the medical arena. Triage is absolutely essential. When someone has suffered a life-threatening accident or incident, without triage, the patient will never make it to rehab. Never. Relief work ministries for the homeless are that triage, enabling the homeless to keep body and soul together long enough to address the underlying issues that have led to trauma of homelessness. Development, on the other hand, is all about the ongoing surgeries, the treatments, the rehabilitation exercises that are needed to move someone from being in crisis to enjoying health, from bleeding to death to becoming actually a blood donor. In relief or triage work, we must stop the bleeding and stabilize the patient. We must prescribe and use pain meds judiciously, only until the patient is at a place where they can be weaned off of those meds and concentrate on the challenge of working the job of healing. And to simply supply the homeless with pain meds of relief that blunt and sometimes do genuinely help the excruciating pain of homelessness without being committed at the same time to the costly surgeries and treatments that are so necessary to move those people off of the social opioid crisis and into health. That creates a social tragedy. So let me suggest simple definitions for both relief and development when it comes to homelessness. Relief work, when it comes to the homeless, is to put it bluntly, the life necessary short-term services that keep the homeless alive so that they can take the necessary steps towards healing and health. Now, those services include food and clothing, basic medical care, temporary shelter that enable the homeless to begin addressing those root issues we've talked about already today. Development, on the other hand, development work with the homeless is about life-giving, longer-term opportunities and options that encourage the homeless to escape the various forms of poverty that made them homeless and help them move into multiple forms of flourishing that will protect them from future homelessness. Now, from these two definitions, I think it's hopefully easy for us to see that while both relief and development work with the homeless are motivated by compassion and love, genuine compassion and love, both of them are. To fixate primarily on relief rather than, I would advocate, primarily on development is an inadequate form of both love and compassion. We're not talking about either or here. Both relief and development are critical. But to look primarily to relief type work to do the work that development must do is a sure recipe for failure. I would contend that the vast majority of social resources must be spent on addressing the issues that led to homelessness. Much like any hospital devotes the lion's share of its space and its staff to the non-emergency room cases, right? Son works up at Sacred Heart. I'm up at the emergency room all the time pastoring a congregation downtown. And that's a very small part of that hospital, but it's a very critical part of that hospital. Spokane does, I think, an excellent job in the emergency room department. When we began to get requests when we were first involved downtown, we started to put together a resource pamphlet, and now that pamphlet is 15 pages long. It's this size. I think about half of those pages are the 7 days a week, Monday through Sunday, the 3 meals a day, that someone in our community, walking distance from where we minister, can enjoy 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Okay? So if you need this, I'd be glad to share it with anybody. And I think that is a testament to the power of our community, because very few communities can say that. Very few communities can say to anybody who's panhandling on the street, you know what? Are you interested in 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, and you can choose multiple places? In fact, some days you could get probably 5 meals if you work it right, you know? Just as in medicine, a correct diagnosis of our patient is vital to successful outcomes. And homelessness is just one of the most visible symptoms of this multifaceted poverty. As we've heard already, people become homeless because they have become poor in more than simply economic terms. Having lots of money, right, can solve homelessness for some people. But I would dare to say it will not solve homelessness for the majority of people, even the vast majority of people. If homelessness were primarily a problem of money, just giving more money to the homeless would be the simple solution. Seattle could solve their homelessness problem of 12,000 people by taking the roughly $1 billion they spend every year on the homeless and giving each of them $100,000. Would that solve the problem? We know it wouldn't. We know it wouldn't. Why is that? Only 6% of those same homeless in Seattle themselves, when asked, say that not being able to afford the rent increases was the precipitating cause of their predicament. 6%. Homelessness is clearly about far more than the economics of affordable housing, as important as that is. When the homeless are themselves asked what factors most contributed to their homelessness, they mention things like family conflict, addiction, job losses, mental challenges. Those are the things that are creating this problem. We do know that drug and alcohol addiction is one of the most frequent problems shared by the homeless. 80% of the homeless have a drug or alcohol problem. So clearly, treatment of that is part of the solution. Furthermore, when 30% of the homeless suffer from serious mental illness, homelessness is clearly more than just a money and housing issue. Just as relief work targets real people, so development work must target the person. And while safe, warm housing is an element of loving compassion, unless that move from the street to housing is accompanied by development of the person, that person will continue to live in poverty. They will continue to be addicted. They will continue to have mental illness. Development work that is truly loving and compassionate must give the homeless opportunities to escape various forms of poverty that will lead to them flourishing as people. So what should Spokane be doing about this? I'm a guy who likes to get to that's the problem. What's the solutions here? Okay, let me suggest just a few on both sides of the fence here. There's plenty of hard data about what is not working in our country in regard to homelessness. Just go do your research, you'll find plenty of it. There is some really good data about what is working in some communities. So on the relief side of the equation, could I suggest this? We, and I'm speaking to myself here, must start working together in coordinating efforts that provide enough food, clothing, and shelter to the homeless to help them survive. But we must stop providing so much that we destroy all incentives for the homeless to actually address the personal poverty issues that got them into homelessness. Now that's a tough balance, right? When the homeless are allowed to defecate on our streets that they are sleeping on, to leave the streets full of trash, which I clean up in the morning. When they are allowed to leave food and needles on the sidewalk that they're living on, that we pick up, get poked by, and then get to spend 6 months having blood tests over, something has gone wrong. When we allow a panhandler to park themselves in front of a business or a residence or a social service agency trying to help them without any real consequences for what they are doing, all the while being offered more food, more clothing, more shelter, something's flawed. We must work together, everybody in this game, to develop systems and procedures that stop rewarding behaviors destructive to both the homeless and to the businesses and the social agencies trying to serve them. This will require nonprofits and businesses and law enforcement to work together in ways we have not to this point. The technology exists. It's there. Other communities are using it. It's our turn to get it. Secondly, we must be lovingly honest enough with ourselves, those of us who are the current social health professionals, to admit that relief efforts unhinged from development work is actually contributing to the problem. Our best intentions are not enough. We must acknowledge that unintended consequences of policies and practices that remove incentives for growth and treatment from the homeless actually hurts them. We've heard those stories already. We must discover and adopt practices that reward the homeless at every step to rebuild their lives, their self-esteem, by tackling their problems of addictions and job searches and mental health and all of that. Third, this is again on the relief side only. We must start defining relief efforts in such a way as to encourage the homeless to begin addressing the other forms of poverty that are keeping them homeless. Homelessness is, as we've heard, largely a symptom of many non-economic poverty factors like relational poverty and familial poverty, employment poverty, mental health poverty, health habit poverty, and spiritual poverty. We may disagree about which ones are most debilitating and which ones have the best effect. But we can at least agree on the fact that we must work together, all of these components, in order to solve the problem. And I would just give a challenge to our public officials to disregard and disassociate religious organizations who have been dealing with homelessness for decades all over the world and have the best track records when it comes to actually helping people out of this lifestyle. That doesn't serve our community. It does not serve our community. Okay, I'll end with the development side because I think I'm over time probably, right? Ronnie, I just ate up your extra time. Okay. Development side. Number one, we must develop systems and strategies for rehousing that reward both the homeless and those who seek to help them in that rehabilitation. This was going to require stair-step strategies for rehousing that actually reward them for doing the hard work of rehabilitation. A 2017 study of Seattle's homeless population found that 63% of the street homeless refused shelters when offered it. And here are the reasons why. This is critical. 40% of them said there are too many rules. And 33% said it's too crowded. And so they prefer to live on the street. 63% preferred the street because they didn't want rules and they didn't want to be around other people. All right, that reveals deeper problems, right? So this is going to require that we improve not only the level of housing in a community, but the work with the people who are rehoused, right? Second thing, for development, we must stop this codependency of the new, what has been labeled homeless industrial complex. It's a system that rewards social service providers by giving them more resources and funding, the worse the problem becomes, okay? So this will demand on our part accountability for results of actually decreasing homelessness itself. See, this is a problem. We're seeing an infusion of resources and capital with an increase in homelessness. Something is drastically wrong when that's happening. It'll require that both donors to nonprofits, such as our nonprofit, and voters for the public offices demand results, not just good intentions. And the problem with making the solution to homelessness primarily about constructing more housing at below market rents is that if you build it, they will come. That's statistically proven in community after community. New York has been building affordable housing since 1934. They have a waiting list of 270,000 families for the housing they currently have. So in those 80 years that that's been happening, they haven't been able to build their way out of homelessness. We must, third point, we must not succumb to the temptation to accept life-destroying addictions as the new norm. We should not elevate addicts as the new protected class by normalizing their behaviors of homelessness. Now, that's not criminalizing homelessness. Facilitating further addiction is not harm reduction for addicts. Instead, such approaches seem to destroy the neighborhoods in which that happens and the cities in which it happens. Existing drug as well as vagrancy laws in cities that are really making progress on this are vigorously enforced. They're not done away with. The combination of providing services and enforcing a zero-tolerance policy for street camping or panhandling or trespassing or property crimes has been an important part of Houston's 60% reduction in homelessness. 60%. Number 4, we must encourage a boom in market rate housing, and I would advocate in the private sector through making significant changes in zoning laws, land use reform, and permitting bureaucracy. The just released study on the state of homelessness in America by the current Council on Economic Advisors indicates that if such changes were made, homelessness would fall by over 30% in the 11 metropolitan areas across the country that together account for 42% of homelessness in our country. Final point. We must recognize that the most consistent cause of homelessness is this disaffiliation and this loss of human relationship. Quoting Alice Baum and Donald Burns, who wrote the definitive book on homelessness in the early 1990s. Homelessness, they say, is a condition of disengagement from the ordinary society, from family, friends, neighbors, church, and community. Poor people who have family ties, teenage moms who have family support systems, mentally ill individuals who are able to maintain social and family relationships, even alcoholics who are still connected to their friends and their jobs, and drug addicts who manage to remain part of the community do not become homeless. Homelessness occurs when people no longer have relationship. Therefore, as a society, our deepest responsibility to prevent homelessness isn't to build more buildings or pass new taxes. It is to rebuild the family, the community, those social bonds that hold us together. That happens one person at a time, one marriage at a time, one family at a time, one neighborhood at a time, and one city at a time. God bless you.